Eritrean People's Liberation Front was a victorious insurgent movement. So when it won its independence, it was a very powerful, hierarchical, cohesive, authoritarian government, because that's how they were when they fought the war. I mean, the legacies of winning the war shape how post-war governance takes place. In South Sudan, which I also don't think that war would have ended without the independence of the South Sudan. They would continue to fight until they had what they so dearly held, and for some very good reasons. But the SPLM, the South Sudan Liberation Movement, was nothing like the EPLF. It was always a hodgepodge, an agglomeration, and you see that in how South Sudan is governed today. Somaliland has been relatively stable, governs itself, is ignored largely, and in some ways for good reason. I mean, not for good reason, but has had the impact of the non-interference in Somaliland, the northern part of Somalia, has probably been good for Somaliland stability.
Where does the emotional piece come in the varied African context? Is it relatively consistent, the way Peter's described it, that there just are these groups that are clearly delineated and feel a sense of difference, or is it more plastic?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of, using, again, my Horn of Africa, the cases that I know best, there's a varied answer to that. In some place like South Sudan, a South Sudanese identity was extremely strong when you were being attacked from the north. We were all Southerners, and they, the Northerners, were attacking us. But then when South Sudan, not surprisingly, when South Sudan got its independence, internal differences became more important. So we're now a Dinka versus a Nuer, or an Equatorian, where a Dinka became politically salient and a way to mobilize and a way to make claims on resources and political power. What I would say in the Eritrean case is that the Eritrean identity is they constructed a multi-ethnic identity. The Eritrean state says there's 9 ethnicities in Eritrea, and I could probably name 7 of them off the top of my head. But there are Afars, and there's Tigrinyas, and the Sahos, and all these other groups. But they became Eritreans through the struggle. It was in the process of resisting the Ethiopian state and what they regarded as illegal Ethiopian occupation. They argued that their struggle was a self-determination struggle. They were a separate Italian colony that was never allowed independence in the same way that Kenya and Botswana and Nigeria were, or Senegal. It wasn't fair, and they had those same rights. In Somaliland, the group that took over Somaliland was called the Somali National Movement.
This group called the Somali National Movement, the SNM, briefly seized Hargeisa and other towns. Barry ordered Soviet MiG jets and American-built tanks to level the city. But it wasn't enough to save his regime. In January of last year, Barry fled to Kenya. His bodyguards gunned down and left to rot outside the presidential palace. In the north, the Isaks inherited a dying land. In Hargeisa, once home to 500,000 people, 50,000 were killed.
They were subjected to artillery shelling, to bombing, to hospitals, and even after they fled their homes, they were subjected to starving and continued artillery shelling.
Rakia Omar was born in Hargeisa, but left as a teenager. As head of the New York-based human rights group Africa Watch, she tried to alert the Western world to Barry's atrocities, a country where justice was a sham.
We documented cases where people were sentenced to life imprisonment simply under a tree. There's no investigation, there's no legal defense. So I wouldn't actually go so far as to call it a trial. It was just some kind of facade that they wanted to go through to show that they were using at least a military form of justice. But it was just pure might, as simple as that.
Was created as a Somali-wide movement, but particularly drew from a particular clan within Somalia, the Isak clan. And so that's a way that a kind of an insurgent group that had a Somali identity when it was launched became more of an Isak identity, and therefore favored the independence of Somaliland. So my larger point in all of this is that where I might disagree with Ambassador Galbraith is that these groups are often fluid. And are you an Isak, or are you a Somali, or are you a Somalilander? Are you a Dinka? Are you a Southern Sudanese? Yes, yes, and yes, depending on the context, depending on the opportunity structures and how you're treated by others. And so it's not that you are Southern Sudanese and you always will be, because the Southern Sudanese suffered so terribly in the Civil War and the violence perpetrated against them from Khartoum. When you're in
Good morning, thank you. My name is Bashir Goth. I'm the representative of Somaliland in Washington, D.C. I was reading your book last night on page 145. I have seen that you have written Somaliland has fulfilled all the theoretical standards of statehood. And that's correct. In my opinion, Somaliland has over the last 27 years been peaceful, stable, and democratic. Actually, we can say a model in the region, and the ambassador will I think, verify that one. It is in a very strategic place across the Bab el-Mandeb. In a volatile region, it's a very peaceful region. It contributes to the stability and peace in the whole region, and I think that's to the interest of the United States, because it prevented terrorism and piracy from the whole region. Don't you think that lack of meaningful engagement will bring instability instead of engaging with Somaliland?
Okay, thank you. And then there.
Well, let me take the case of Somaliland first. To me, this is open and shut. Of course, it should be recognized as an independent sovereign state. It's operated that way for 27 years. And that's, Somaliland is a perfect example of the kind of absurdity of a policy that is based on the, preserving forever the territorial integrity of a state that actually doesn't exist, that is Somalia within the borders on the map. With regard to South Yemen, I know the history. I don't know enough, but you do have a geographic area. You do have a different political history from Sana'a, Yemen, maybe particularly acute now. I mean, I would also say if there was a genuine, overwhelming support on the part of the people of South Yemen, then that would be their entitlement. And I want to emphasize this isn't, well, yes, there's a moral issue, but the UN Charter is based on moral issues. This is a matter of international law. The UN Charter in the very first article speaks of the right of self-determination of peoples. And there is a whole body of international law going back, including the Montevideo Convention in the 1930s, that talk about this as a matter of international law. There are, however, competing principles of international law. There's a genocide convention. And so it's not a moral matter to say that if you go out and you massacre the people who would vote the other way in your territory, you drive them out, you have a Srebrenica, Visegrad, and all these places, well, maybe then everybody's left doesn't get to vote. I mean, Quebec couldn't just expel all the English speakers and then say, oh, well, now we get to have a referendum on independence. So that's a very practical matter. And I won't go into a detailed explanation of U.S. policy toward in Croatia, but I can simply say that we did everything we could to bring about a peaceful settlement within Croatia of the Krajina issue, and we strongly opposed Tudjman's effort to prevent the return of Serbs, and ultimately, as a result of U.S. pressure, significantly, Croatia did restore citizenship, did allow people to reclaim their property. Sadly, only a percentage of them have come back. And I know we could debate this, Mr. Kesich, for many hours because God knows I have.
Terence, I assume you don't want to go into the Republic of Srpska, but you might want to talk about Somaliland.
It's a lovely spot. I'd be happy to go into it. No, I do want to say a word on Somaliland, though, because I do think there's a couple of different principles that worth teasing out. One question is, do they have the attributes of statehood? And we've gone back to that, and I think that's the reference in the book, that there's a people and a region and so forth. But the other criteria is, will recognition increase or decrease violence? That's the other criteria, right? Is doing this going to increase or decrease violence? I think there's a case to be made for Somaliland that recognition will decrease violence. It will allow a country to become more normalized. The U.S. position, I think most of the international community is that they're not going to recognize Somaliland until the African Union recognizes Somaliland. They're not going to go against the African Union's position because it ain't our business as much as it's their business, and so on. I'm not sure that's the end of the debate because it leaves the U.S. policy and European policy it limits the options because of what the African Union in its own wisdom wishes to do. But it does also put Somaliland in a kind of a difficult position. We're going to get deep into the weeds here, but Somaliland was British Somaliland while the rest of Somalia was Italian Somaliland, and they actually were two different independence processes. And so from a very narrow international legal point of view, you could say this is self-determination. The Somalilanders and Somalis merged, but now they want a divorce. And can't one party divorce if that party wishes to divorce? Or can the other party say, no, you can't divorce, you must remain part of me? And that is a difficult position, I think, to take internationally. Somaliland's a great story, by the way. It really is a great story.
Yemen cases.
Grateful to you all for coming. I hope that you will read Self-Determination Success. It's on the CSS website, css.org. You can download any chapter you'd like for free. I want to thank Denise Natali, Pierre Galbraith, Terrence Lyons. I want to thank you for your excellent questions. We look forward to continuing the discussion. Thank you very much.
That was really good. That was a nice job.